Welcome to today's Psych with Sigmund, where we're going to explore a fascinating concept in psychology, the mere exposure effect. This phenomenon has been studied extensively in the field of social psychology and has significant implications for our daily lives. So, let's dive right in. The mere exposure effect refers to the tendency for people to develop a preference for things simply because they are familiar with them. This can include anything from products and brands to ideas and even people. The more we're exposed to something, the more likely we are to like it, even if we don't consciously realize why. But where did this concept come from? The mere exposure effect was first introduced by psychologist Robert Zajonc in the 1960s. Zajonc's research showed that repeated exposure to a stimulus could increase liking for that stimulus, even if the stimulus itself didn't change. This challenged traditional views of attitude formation, which suggested that people's preferences were based on rational evaluations of the stimuli themselves. So, what drives the mere exposure effect? One key theory is the idea of cognitive fluency. This refers to the ease with which we can process information. When we're exposed to something repeatedly, it becomes easier for our brains to process, and this fluency is misattributed as a positive feeling towards the stimulus. Think about it like this. When you see an ad for a product multiple times, it starts to feel more familiar, and that familiarity can be mistaken for liking. Another important factor is classical conditioning, a concept developed by Ivan Pavlov. Classical conditioning suggests that we learn to associate stimuli with certain responses or emotions. In the case of the mere exposure effect, repeated exposure to a stimulus can lead to a conditioned response of liking or preference. One classic study by Zajonc himself found that people who were shown a series of random shapes repeatedly began to prefer those shapes over new ones they hadn't seen before. More recent studies have applied this concept to real-world scenarios, such as marketing and consumer behavior. For example, research has shown that repeated exposure to a brand's advertising can increase consumers' preference for that brand, even if the ads themselves don't contain any new or compelling information. But the mere exposure effect isn't limited to consumer behavior. It also has implications for social relationships and even mental health. Research has shown that people tend to form friendships with those they're repeatedly exposed to, such as coworkers or classmates. This can be attributed to the mere exposure effect, where repeated exposure increases liking and familiarity. On the other hand, excessive exposure to negative stimuli, such as violent media or toxic social environments, can have detrimental effects on our mental health. This highlights the importance of being mindful of what we're exposing ourselves to and how it might impact our well-being. So, how can understanding the mere exposure effect help us in our everyday lives? For one, it can make us more critical thinkers. By recognizing when our preferences or attitudes might be influenced by familiarity rather than objective merit, we can make more informed decisions. This is especially important in areas like consumer behavior, where marketing strategies often rely on repeated exposure to influence our purchasing decisions. Moreover, the mere exposure effect can be harnessed for positive change. For instance, if you're trying to develop a new habit or get into a hobby, repeated exposure to related stimuli can increase your motivation and enjoyment. This is why many therapists recommend gradual exposure to feared objects or situations as a way to overcome phobias or anxieties. By recognizing the power of familiarity in shaping our minds, we can cultivate a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world around us. That's all for today's Psych with Sigmund. Remember to like, share, and subscribe, and until next time, may your ego find balance between pleasure and reality.